Hi there. Welcome back to another episode of Everyday English Podcast. I'm Myra, and with me today is Alex.
Hi, everyone. So for today's episode, we're going to be talking about some of the most common misconceptions in English learning. These are things that a lot of learners believe, but which might actually be holding them back.
Absolutely. Let's start with pronunciation. One really common misconception is that you need to have a perfect native, like accent, to be good at English.
Right. A lot of learners spend an inordinate amount of time trying to mimic the exact pronunciation of native speakers. But the truth is, English is spoken in so many different accents around the world.
Exactly. For example, there's the British accent, the American accent, the Australian accent, and countless regional accents within each of those countries. And then there are the accents of non-native English speakers who use English as a lingua franca.
And as long as your pronunciation is clear enough for others to understand you, that's what really matters. You don't need to sound exactly like a native speaker from a particular region.
Another pronunciation-related misconception is that you can learn to pronounce words correctly just by reading the phonetic symbols in a dictionary.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of learners rely solely on that. But phonetic symbols are just a guide. You really need to listen to native speakers or proficient speakers pronouncing the words.
For instance, take the word schedule. It's pronounced different in American English and British English. Just looking at the phonetic symbols might not give you a full understanding of how the word actually sounds in context.
And don't forget about connected speech. Words in English often blend together when people are speaking naturally. For example, I am often becomes ammy, and going to often becomes gonna. Learners who don't pay attention to this might sound very stilted.
Moving on to grammar. A big misconception is that grammar is the most important part of learning English.
I agree. While grammar is important, focusing too much on it can be a problem. Some learners spend all their time memorizing grammar rules, but they can't actually use the language in real life situations.
Exactly. You can know all the grammar rules in the book, but if you can't have a conversation or write an email that makes sense, then what's the point?
And another grammar-related myth is that there's only one correct way to use grammar. In fact, English has a lot of flexibility. For example, in some cases, both the present perfect and the simple past can be used. And the difference is more about the context and the speaker's intention.
Like, I have lived in this city for 5 years, and I lived in this city for 5 years. The first one emphasizes the connection to the present, while the second one is more about a past experience that may or may not have an impact on the present. But in many situations, both are acceptable.
Also, learners often think that they need to master all the grammar rules before they can start speaking. But in reality, you can start speaking with just a basic understanding of grammar and improve as you go along.
Now, let's talk about vocabulary. One common mistake is thinking that learning long, complex words is the key to sounding intelligent in English.
Yeah, I've seen learners try to use really big words in every sentence, but it often ends up sounding forced. In everyday conversations, simple and clear language is usually better.
And sometimes using the wrong big word can actually make your message less clear. For example, using utilize instead of use when use would be more appropriate.
Another vocabulary-related misconception is that you can learn vocabulary by just memorizing lists of words.
Right? Memorizing lists can be helpful, but you need to learn how to use those words in context. Otherwise, you might not know when it's appropriate to use a particular word.
For example, you might memorize the word ebullient, but if you don't know that it's usually used to describe a person's enthusiastic and energetic personality, you might use it in the wrong way.
And learners often forget that there are different types of vocabulary. There's academic vocabulary, everyday vocabulary, and specialized vocabulary for different fields like medicine or law.
Exactly! You need to focus on the type of vocabulary that's relevant to your goals. And if you're learning English for business, you should focus on business-related vocabulary.
Now, let's consider the role of translation in English learning. A big misconception is that you always need to translate everything from your native language into English.
Yeah, this can really slow down the learning process. Constantly translating in your head can make it difficult to think in English directly.
For example, when you're trying to have a conversation, if you have to translate every thought into English, you'll be much slower and might not be able to respond in a timely manner.
And it can also lead to unnatural sounding English because you might be using sentence structures or word choices that are more typical of your native language.
Another aspect is the idea that watching English, language movies or TV shows with subtitles in your native language is the best way to learn.
While subtitles can be helpful at first, relying too much on them can be a problem. You might end up just reading the subtitles instead of listening to the English.
It's better to start with subtitles in English, and then gradually move on to watching without subtitles. This way, you can really focus on the listening and comprehension skills.
And don't forget about reading. A common mistake is thinking that reading only textbooks or academic materials is the best way to improve your English.
Right. Reading a variety of materials is important. You should read novels, newspapers, magazines, and even online blogs. Different types of texts will expose you to different styles of writing and vocabulary.
For example, a novel might have a lot of colloquial language and character-driven dialogue, while a newspaper article will have more formal language and current affairs-related vocabulary.
Also, learners often believe that they need to understand every single word when they're reading. But in fact, you can often guess the meaning of unfamiliar words from the context.
Exactly. If you stop every time you see a new word and look it up in the dictionary, it can disrupt your reading flow and make it less enjoyable.
Now, let's talk about language learning apps. A lot of people think that using just language learning apps is enough to become proficient in English.
Yeah, apps can be a great supplementary tool, but they're not a substitute for real life practice. You can have a meaningful conversation with an app.
And some apps focus too much on memorization and drills, rather than on practical communication skills.
True. You need to combine app-based learning with other methods like speaking with real people, reading, and listening to authentic materials.
Another misconception is that you need to be in an English-speaking country to learn English well.
While being in an English-speaking environment can be beneficial, it's definitely not the only way. With the internet, there are so many resources available to learn English.
You can find language exchange partners online, join English speaking groups, and access a wealth of English language content like podcasts, videos, and online courses.
And even if you're not in an English-speaking country, you can create your own English learning environment. For example, change the language settings on your phone and computer to English.
Now let's consider the aspect of motivation. A common myth is that you need to be highly motivated all the time to learn English.
Right. Motivation comes and goes. The key is to build habits. If you make learning English a part of your daily routine, like brushing your teeth, you'll be more likely to stick with it.
Exactly. You don't need to feel super excited every day to study English. Just doing a little bit each day, even when you don't feel like it, can lead to long-term progress.
And learners often think that they need to learn English alone, but in fact, having a study partner or joining a study group can be really motivating.
You can encourage each other, practice speaking together, and share learning resources. It can make the learning process more fun and engaging.
Also, people often believe that they're too old to learn English, but age is just a number. As long as you have the desire and the right approach, you can learn English at any age.
Absolutely. Older learners might have different learning styles and paces, but they also have more life experience that can be an advantage in understanding and using the language.
Now, let's get back to speaking. A big fear among learners is making mistakes. They think that if they make a mistake, they'll look stupid.
But making mistakes is a natural part of the learning process. In fact, you learn more from your mistakes than from always getting things right.
And native speakers make mistakes too. They just correct themselves and move on. Learners should have the same attitude.
Another speaking-related misconception is that you need to wait until you're perfect before you start speaking in public or with others.
That's a huge mistake. The more you practice speaking, the better you'll get. You need to put yourself out there and have those conversations, even if you're not completely confident.
And don't be afraid to ask people to repeat or clarify things if you don't understand. Most people are happy to help.
Now, let's talk about writing. One common problem is that learners think that using a lot of complex sentence structures and big words will make their writing better.
As we mentioned before, clarity is key. Sometimes, simple sentences can convey your message more effectively than convoluted ones.
And learners often forget to revise and edit their writing. Just writing a first draft and submitting it is not enough. You need to check for grammar mistakes, spelling errors, and make sure your ideas flow logically.
Also, they might not get enough feedback on their writing. It's important to have someone else, like a teacher or a native, speaking friend, read your writing and give you suggestions for improvement.
Another related myth is that you need to have a lot of inspiration to write well. While inspiration can be helpful, writing is also a skill that you can develop through practice.
You can start by writing short paragraphs or journal entries every day. Over time, your writing skills will improve.
Now, let's consider listening. A common misconception is that listening to English podcasts or music is enough to improve your listening skills.
While these are great resources, you also need to practice active listening. This means really focusing on what you're hearing, taking notes if necessary, and trying to understand the main ideas and details.
And don't just listen to one type of material. Listen to different accents, different topics, and different types of audio like lectures, interviews, and conversations.
Also, learners often think that they need to understand every word when they're listening. But in real life situations, you don't always catch every word, and that's okay. You can still get the gist of what's being said.
Now, let's talk about the idea of fluent English. A lot of learners think that being fluent means being able to speak without any pauses or mistakes.
But fluency is more about being able to communicate effectively, express your ideas clearly, and understand others. It's not about being perfect.
Native speakers don't speak without pauses. They use fillers like and all the time, and they make minor mistakes too.
Another aspect is the belief that you need to learn English in a certain order, like grammar first, then vocabulary, then speaking.
In reality, you can start all these aspects at the same time. You can learn some basic grammar, some useful vocabulary, and start practicing speaking and listening right away. They all reinforce each other.
And learners often think that they need to have a lot of time to learn English. But even if you only have 15-20 minutes a day, you can make progress.
You can use that time to learn a few new words, practice a grammar point, or listen to a short English audio clip.
Now, let's consider the role of culture in English learning. A common mistake is thinking that you can learn English without learning about the cultures where it's spoken.
Right. English is not just a language, it's also associated with many different cultures. Understanding cultural norms, idioms, and references can really enhance your language skills.
For example, if you don't know about American culture, you might not understand the references in an American TV show or the meaning of certain idiomatic expressions.
And learning about different cultures can also make your language learning more interesting and engaging.
Another related misconception is that all English-speaking countries have the same culture. But in fact, the cultures of the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and other English-speaking countries are quite different.
You need to be aware of these differences if you want to communicate effectively with people from different English-speaking backgrounds.
Now, let's talk about the idea of language talent. A lot of people think that some people are just naturally good at learning languages, and if they're not, they'll never be able to learn English well.
But the truth is, while some people might pick up languages more quickly, anyone can learn English with the right amount of effort and the right learning strategies.
It's about consistency, practice, and having a positive attitude. Don't give up just because you think you don't have a language talent.
And learners often compare themselves to others, which can be demotivating. Everyone has their own learning pace. Focus on your own progress and celebrate your achievements, no matter how small.
Another common myth is that you can learn English overnight. Learning a language takes time and patience. It's a long-term commitment.
You might see some quick, fixed language courses promising to make you fluent in a short time. But in reality, sustainable language learning is a gradual process.
Now, let's get back to the topic of grammar. Some learners think that if they make a grammar mistake, the whole sentence is wrong, and no one will understand them.
But in most cases, people can still understand the general meaning of what you're trying to say, even with a grammar mistake. Of course, it's good to try to correct your grammar over time, but don't let the fear of making mistakes stop you from speaking or writing.
And learners often think that grammar rules are set in stone. But language is constantly evolving, and some grammar rules might change over time or be different in different varieties of English.
For example, the use of they as a singular pronoun to refer to a person of unknown gender is becoming more and more accepted, even though it was considered incorrect in the past.
Now let's talk about vocabulary learning again. A common mistake is not revisiting and reviewing the words you've learned.
Yeah, if you don't review vocabulary regularly, you'll forget it. You can use flashcards, spaced, repetition apps, or just make a habit of going over your vocabulary lists at regular intervals.
And learners often don't learn the collocations of words. For example, you can't just say make a research. The correct collocation is do research. Learning collocations is an important part of building a strong vocabulary.
Another vocabulary related issue is not understanding the connotations of words. Some words might have a positive, negative, or neutral connotation. For example, skinny has a slightly negative connotation compared to slim.
Now, let's consider the aspect of pronunciation again. Learners often don't pay attention to intonation. Intonation can change the meaning of a sentence.
Right. For example, a statement can sound like a question if the intonation is wrong. Paying attention to intonation patterns can really improve your communication skills.
And they might not practice the pronunciation of individual sounds enough. Some English sounds might not exist in their native language, and they need to spend extra time practicing those sounds to be understood clearly.
Now, let's talk about the role of textbooks in English learning. A common misconception is that a textbook is the only source of learning.
Textbooks are useful, but they should be used in combination with other resources. They might not cover all the real, life language use, or the latest language trends.
You can supplement your textbook learning with online resources, language learning apps, real-life conversations.
And learners often think that they need to finish one textbook completely before moving on to another. But you can pick and choose the parts of different textbooks that are most relevant to your needs.
Now, let's consider the idea of immersion in English learning. Some people think that just being in an English speaking environment is enough to learn English.
While immersion can be helpful, you still need to be actively engaged in the learning process. You can't just passively absorb the language.
You need to ask questions, participate in conversations, and seek out learning opportunities even when you're in an English speaking